For the first time in many years, NASA stepped forward with a statement that did not sound like a standard press release or an attempt to reassure the public. Instead, their tone carried something unusual, an undercurrent of tension, a restrained urgency, a kind of carefully measured fear. "We are standing on the threshold of a new discovery," they said, and the data concerning the interstellar object known as 3I Atlas suggests that we may soon face revelations of an unprecedented and disturbing nature. No details followed, no graphs, no telemetry, no public explanation. Only the promise of news that will change our understanding, followed immediately by a silence so sharp it felt intentional. And while official agencies paused, delayed, and redirected questions, independent observatories continued to collect raw data that revealed something NASA had chosen not to share. Atlas was not behaving like a comet, nor like any natural body ever observed in our system. At times it dimmed almost to invisibility, its reflective signature collapsing into the noise floor as though someone had switched it off. Moments later it flared back to life with a brightness inconsistent with any known sublimation process. Its motion betrayed no trace of inertial drift. Instead, it performed subtle adjustments, course corrections with no gravitational justification, micro-maneuvers too deliberate to be mistakes. And layered within the faint electromagnetic haze surrounding the object were pulses repeating, patterned, structured radio emissions exhibiting a periodicity that matched neither background noise nor cosmic interference. They were not artifacts, they were signals, encoded, directed, intentional. By this point, the question no longer concerned what 3I Atlas was doing, but rather why it was doing it, and even more importantly, who or what had built something capable of such behaviour, because natural objects do not extinguish their reflectivity and reignite it seconds later. They do not execute controlled deceleration. They do not release synchronized fragments that maintain formation, and they do not emit signals with mathematical rhythm. Atlas was showing a level of coherence and responsiveness that forced scientists to confront a possibility no agency was prepared to articulate publicly. The object might not be a passive traveller. It might not even be uninhabited. Its behaviour suggested internal structure, internal mechanism, and perhaps internal observers. And if that possibility felt extreme, it was only because humanity has never been taught to expect the truth to arrive quietly. This is the moment where a difficult but unavoidable question emerges. People ask, how could our civilization have gone unnoticed until now? How could another intelligence cross the darkness, approach our sun, examine our worlds, and remain hidden from us? How can such a thing be possible? The answer is simple. But before we come to it, we must ask something even more important. What is the true nature of Atlas, and what kind of intelligence could dwell within such an object? Because only by understanding the origins and design of Atlas can we begin to grasp the magnitude of what is unfolding above us, and only then will you be prepared to hear the things I'm about to reveal, things so extraordinary and so deeply unsettling that they redefine not only our place in the cosmos, but the very history of our species. From the very first attempts to classify 3I Atlas, it became clear that forcing this object into any familiar category, comet, asteroid, interstellar fragment, was nothing more than a reflex, a desperate attempt to reconcile the impossible with the language of the ordinary. But the deeper the analysis went, the more sharply Atlas separated itself from every known natural body. A comet brightens and dims as sunlight vaporizes its surface. Atlas dimmed abruptly, completely, as though an internal system had shut down its reflective layer. A comet responds to gravitational pulls. Atlas deviated from projected paths with corrections so precise they resembled navigation. A comet releases dust chaotically. Atlas emitted streams of particles that maintained alignment with its motion, behaving less like a debris plume and more like controlled exhaust. Every signature pointed not to disorder, but to function, a consistency that scientists recognized only reluctantly, because acknowledging function meant acknowledging design. Natural objects flicker, scatter, vary. Atlas glowed with the steadiness of controlled illumination. The brightness was not a reaction. It was a choice. Acceleration data carried the same fingerprint. Trajectory predictions consistently failed in a very specific way. Atlas was always slightly ahead of where gravity alone would place it, as though an additional force nudged it forward in small disciplined increments. These corrections were timed, not continuous, not random, but pulsed. And each pulse corresponded to a faint electromagnetic surge detected across multiple observatories, a surge that exhibited the same harmonic structure as the radio bursts embedded within the object's perimeter. The implication pressed heavily on every analyst who saw the data. Atlas was not drifting. Atlas was maintaining. Radio analysis completed the picture. The emissions were not noise. They were not solar reflections. They were not background contamination. They were structured, repeating at intervals that grew shorter as the object approached its closest point to the sun. The signals exhibited clustering that pointed to segmentation bits, bursts, packets. And the most unnerving detail was their directionality. They were not broadcasting randomly in all directions as natural bodies tend to scatter radiation. Instead, the signals formed a narrow transmission cone aimed consistently toward a region of deep interstellar space, the same direction from which Atlas had arrived. When this dataset was finally reviewed without the filters of conventional assumptions, a singular and chilling realization settled across the scientific community. Atlas behaved like an engineered probe maintaining coherence under changing environmental conditions. It dimmed when it needed to hide, brightened when it needed energy, compensated when gravity distorted its path, and transmitted when significant thresholds were reached. No natural object executes behavior that maps so cleanly onto operational intent. Still, the most disquieting part was not what Atlas did, but how effortlessly it did it. The object never produced excessive heat signatures, never left chaotic trails of debris, never displayed vibrations or irregular patterns typical of mechanical systems. Whatever moved within it, or whatever machinery constituted it, operated with such integration into its structure that distinguishing the natural from the engineered became impossible. Atlas was not a vehicle. It was an organism of geometry and intention, built with a sophistication beyond anything humanity could mimic. And as researchers attempted to reconcile these anomalies, a deeper truth settled beneath the data like a shadow. If Atlas was engineered, then its presence in our solar system was not random. It was deliberate, and if it was deliberate, then the object was here for a reason, one we were only beginning to uncover. As scientists pushed beyond the initial anomalies and examined Atlas through the lens of motion rather than composition, they encountered behaviors that dismantled the last remaining assumptions about its natural origin. In celestial mechanics, movement is truth. No matter how strange an object appears, its trajectory reveals the forces acting upon it: gravity, inertia, radiation pressure. These are the silent sculptors of every orbit and drift. But Atlas refused to obey those sculptors. Instead of yielding to the predictable arcs charted by gravitational influence, it demonstrated a pattern of motion that suggested not reaction, but intention. Subtle course corrections occurred at intervals far too precise to be fragments breaking off or jets of sublimation firing at random. Instead, they resembled navigational impulses, brief, controlled, and perfectly timed, the kind of micro-adjustments made only by systems designed to maintain stability in an unpredictable environment. During one particularly well-documented observation window, Atlas executed a lateral shift of such extraordinary smoothness that the analysts spent weeks attempting to fit it into existing models. Natural comets do not drift sideways. They tumble, they shed mass, they pivot slowly in response to thermal forces, but they do not glide. Yet Atlas glided its motion clean, laminar, devoid of the chaotic wobble expected from shifting centers of mass. The shift occurred in synchrony with a faint but measurable electromagnetic swell, as if an internal system had briefly activated to counteract a perturbation or reorient the object for reasons unknown. The phenomenon repeated itself multiple times, forming a rhythm that, once recognized, became impossible to dismiss. Atlas was not riding the forces of space, it was negotiating them. Even more unsettling were the moments when Atlas appeared to lose all visible luminosity, entering a phase of complete optical collapse. For natural objects, such behavior is impossible without catastrophic disintegration. But Atlas did not fragment, did not evaporate, did not rotate into darkness. It simply ceased to reflect light, not gradually, but instantaneously. And when it emerged from these episodes, its brightness returned with a uniformity that mirrored controlled illumination rather than reflected sunlight. Comets transition through brightness phases according to solar heating. Atlas shifted in a manner resembling a system toggling between operational states. In one state, it was observationally dormant, nearly invisible. In another, it radiated with a spectral purity that defied the chaotic scattering of dust and ice. But the behavior that struck the scientific community hardest was the acceleration signature. As Atlas approached certain positions relative to the Sun, it exhibited tiny bursts of speed burst that did not correlate with solar heating, gravitational gradients, or tidal effects. Each burst matched a specific electromagnetic pulse detected simultaneously across multiple observatories. These pulses carried a structure. They were not random emissions, but patterned, oscillating with a frequency drift that resembled a system compensating for environmental variables. In essence, Atlas accelerated not because the Sun pushed it, but because something inside it provided thrust. And the thrust was too clean, too controlled, too sparse to be chemical or nuclear. It bore the mathematical signature of propulsion governed by principles humanity has not yet understood. Combined, these anomalies painted a portrait not of a comet, but of a craft, or at least of something that behaves as one. Its maneuvers were purposeful, its luminosity was regulated, its acceleration was orchestrated. Any attempt to explain these characteristics as natural would require rewriting every known law of astrophysics. And yet, the most unsettling element was not the controlled motion itself. It was the restraint embedded within it. Atlas moved just enough to maintain stability, just enough to compensate, just enough to guide itself along a trajectory that appeared both deliberate and efficient. It never wasted energy. It never overcorrected. It never acted dramatically. Its engineering, if it was engineering, was not simply advanced. It was ancient, elegant, and terrifyingly precise. And as scientists continued to model the object's behavior, one question loomed larger than all others. If Atlas moved with intention, then what destination was it correcting for? The deeper scientists probed into the strange electromagnetic haze surrounding Atlas, the more impossible it became to treat the object as a passive traveller. Natural bodies reflect radio waves poorly and inconsistently, scattering them in chaotic patterns shaped by irregular surfaces and tumbling rotation. But Atlas did not scatter. It emitted. It pulsed. It spoke in a way no comet could through tightly structured bursts of radio energy, whose precision suggested neither randomness nor noise, but architecture. These emissions were faint enough to hide beneath the hum of cosmic background radiation, yet orderly enough to stand out the moment researchers applied harmonic extraction algorithms. And once the patterns were isolated, the scientific community faced the most chilling revelation of the entire encounter. Atlas was transmitting information. The pulses followed intervals too perfect to be geological or thermal. They emerged in clusters separated by exact ratios, recurring with mathematical purity, the kind found only in engineered systems. Even more disturbing was the internal structure of each burst. Within the pulses were modulations, subtle, nested variations exhibiting the unmistakable imprint of encoding. Not symbolic in the human sense, but algorithmic, layered like data packets. The signal strength was weak, almost deliberately restrained, as if Atlas did not intend to be detected by instruments as primitive as those on Earth. And yet, for brief windows when conditions aligned, the emissions rose just enough to be captured by telescopes sensitive to deep space radio noise. But the detail that froze every analyst who examined the data was the directionality of the pulses. They were not radiating outward in all directions. They were not bleeding energy into space indiscriminately. They were aimed, focused. Each burst formed a narrow beam pointing toward the region of interstellar space from which Atlas had arrived. It was not a flare. It was a message delivered across vast distances, encoded in patterns designed to withstand time and distortion. The object was not merely responding to conditions within the solar system, it was reporting. At first, the consensus was that the signal must contain navigation data, perhaps a record of Atlas's position, velocity, and environmental conditions. But as the decoding efforts advanced, it became clear that the internal structure of the burst did not match navigational formats known to humans. Instead, the bursts resembled alternating blocks of variable density-like observations, compressed into abstracted sets. This prompted an even more unsettling theory. The pulses might be transmitting results, either results of Atlas's activities within the solar system, or results of something it had been designed to search for. Then came the final breakthrough. When researchers synchronized the timing of the pulses with Atlas's behavioral anomalies, its sudden dimming, its controlled accelerations, its corrections, an eerie alignment emerged. The strongest pulses occurred immediately after periods of activity resembling deep scanning maneuvers. When Atlas changed orientation in ways consistent with sensory recalibration, new bursts followed shortly after. When Atlas passed regions in space that allowed for optimal outbound transmission, the emissions intensified. It became painfully clear that Atlas was not simply broadcasting, it was sending updates, and the most disturbing part was not the existence of the transmissions, it was their consistency. The pulses repeated at intervals so exact that analysts could predict when the next emission would occur within fractions of a second. No comet, no asteroid, no natural body behaves with such mechanistic precision. Only engineered systems follow cycles with that level of discipline, and only systems designed for long-duration missions send data outward with such deliberate structure. All of this forced the Council to confront a question that had, until this moment, lingered only at the edges of their thoughts. If Atlas was transmitting information, then who was receiving it? The possibility that the object contained its own intelligence, whether biological, artificial, or something far older, became impossible to dismiss. The object behaved as if inhabited. Its emissions behaved as if deliberate. Its pulses behaved as if it were communicating with something that already knew what to expect. The unsettling truth was that Atlas might not have been alone in purpose. It might have been part of a network and emissary, or a mechanism designed to observe, evaluate, and report. And once this idea took root, it opened the door to the question that every analyst feared. If Atlas was transmitting about us, what exactly did it say? When the first attempts were made to analyze the composition of Atlas's nucleus, researchers expected the usual chemical signatures, volatile ices, primitive dust, fragments from the interstellar medium. Instead, every reading pointed toward a material profile so anomalous that it forced laboratories to recalibrate their instruments multiple times, believing the fault lay not in the data, but in the devices themselves. It quickly became apparent that Atlas was not built from the fragile mixture of ice and stone that defines even the most resilient comets. Its nucleus exhibited a resilience that defied thermal stress, radiation exposure, and gravitational strain. Where ordinary cometary material fractures, crumbles, and sublimates, Atlas remained intact, absorbing extreme solar heating without losing mass in any measurable quantity. This alone raised suspicion, but the deeper analysis delivered something far more unsettling. Spectroscopy revealed that the surface compound was layered with a matrix of elements that do not naturally occur together in such stable configurations. Certain heavy metals appeared in ratios inconsistent with stellar nucleosynthesis. Trace isotopes were arranged in a manner that suggested refining, not random cosmic aggregation. Even more disturbing was the crystalline lattice detected in scattered reflections, a geometric pattern so uniform that it appeared engineered, like interlocking plates rather than chaotic mineral clusters. Natural objects do not self-organize into structures with that level of symmetry. They fracture, they erode, they deform. Yet Atlas's surface reflected light with the precision of a composite shell. The real shock came when deeper spectral scans were attempted. Instruments that normally penetrate cometary crusts found themselves unable to read past a certain threshold. A dense internal layer absorbed, scattered, or rerouted energy beams in ways that suggested a deliberate design to obscure internal composition. The absorption pattern was not random. Its curve matched that of known metamaterials, substances engineered to manipulate electromagnetic waves. Scientists had only theorized materials with such properties. Atlas demonstrated them effortlessly. Even when higher energy scans were applied, the penetration depth increased only marginally, as though the interior core was shielded, compartmentalized, protected. But the most terrifying implication emerged from the energy response. When the object brightened or dimmed, its spectral signature shifted slightly, not due to sublimation or chemical changes, but due to the realignment of internal structures. The shifts resembled the behavior of adaptive systems, similar to how artificial materials reconfigure under electrical input. Except Atlas was not responding to any known external trigger. It was adjusting itself. Its surface behavior was not a passive consequence of sunlight. It was controlled, regulated, the output of an underlying mechanism with purpose. some researchers attempted to explain this adaptive quality as the result of exotic interstellar chemistry. Perhaps Atlas had originated in a region of space where materials form under conditions unknown to the solar system. But even that hypothesis collapsed when the emission spectra revealed patterns eerily similar to the energy dampening systems theorized in advanced propulsion studies. Natural materials do not suppress specific radio bands. They do not reflect outbound pulses while absorbing inbound ones. They do not emit narrow spectrum bursts in response to orientation shifts. Atlas did all of these, and then came the detail that removed all doubt. During one observational window, as Atlas rotated slightly, multiple observatories recorded synchronous spikes of polarized reflections that formed a consistent grid across the object's surface. The grid spacing was uniform, repeating with mathematical precision, like panels engineered to function as part of a structural shell. The pattern remained visible for only seconds before the object dimmed again, as if the reflective state had been deliberately suppressed. No comet in the history of astronomy has ever exhibited such behavior. No fragment of primordial rock demonstrates adaptive reflectivity, directional shielding, structural synchronization, or internal energy modulation. These are not traits of a natural body, they are traits of construction. And as the scientific community reluctantly began to accept that Atlas was not merely an interstellar wanderer, but a deliberately engineered object, a heavier truth took shape among the analysts. If the materials of Atlas were designed, then so was its mission. Once the structural and behavioral anomalies of Atlas became too numerous to dismiss, attention shifted toward the organizations responsible for communicating extraterrestrial observations to the public. And it was here, in the silence between official statements, that the most revealing patterns emerged. NASA, along with several international observatories, had maintained an unusually consistent level of restraint that did not match the magnitude of the anomalies being recorded. While the scientific community privately grappled with data that overturned fundamental principles of astrophysics, public-facing reports continued to describe Atlas as a typical interstellar comet, a description so profoundly out of alignment with reality that it could not plausibly have been an error. It was a choice. The first and most notable red flag came in the form of a 6-week informational blackout. During a period when Atlas exhibited its most violent brightness fluctuations, executing maneuvers that defied all known orbital mechanics, and emitting radio signatures inconsistent with any natural origin, NASA suspended the release of raw optical and spectral data. The timing was not coincidental. Nearly every significant anomaly occurred during this blackout window. The explanation offered to the public, a technical backlog and staffing complications, collapsed under scrutiny once independent researchers uncovered that all observation systems had remained fully operational. The instruments were collecting data. The agencies simply were not releasing it. Even more telling was the language used in the few statements NASA did provide. Instead of acknowledging uncertainties, they insisted repeatedly that Atlas was behaving like a comet, despite mounting evidence that contradicted the claim. This phrasing was not scientific, it was defensive. A genuine scientific response would have emphasized the unexplained nature of the observations, the need for further analysis, or the unusual dynamics of the object. Instead, the narrative pushed toward simplicity, toward normalization, toward reassurance. It read less like analysis and more like containment. Internal inconsistencies further deepened suspicion. Several NASA-affiliated teams initially published reports noting irregular photometric patterns, only for those reports to vanish or be replaced with heavily sanitized summaries. Graphs disappeared. Raw numbers were replaced with averages. An entire section discussing anomalous acceleration was removed from a publicly accessible preprint not long after being posted. In parallel, statements from ESA and JAXA shifted tone, mirroring NASA's insistence on conventional language, even as their private telemetry leaked by independent researchers clearly indicated otherwise. Then came the most telling contradiction of all. While publicly describing Atlas as a fragile interstellar body undergoing natural disintegration, NASA quietly increased the frequency of deep space monitoring sessions, redirecting equipment usually reserved for high-priority asteroid tracking. In other words, their actions demonstrated concern, their words demonstrated dismissal. This divergence made one thing clear. The agency was aware of Atlas's anomalies long before it acknowledged them, and the staged simplicity of the public narrative served a single purpose: to delay widespread recognition that something in our solar system was behaving intelligently. And when congressional committees later requested internal documentation regarding Atlas, the responses were unusually limited. Sections were redacted without explanation, timestamps were omitted, data tables were missing. The silence was too strategic to be accidental. Agencies do not hide information about harmless comets. They hide information about objects that defy classification. The scientists who privately studied Atlas knew this pattern well. It was the same pattern used whenever an anomaly threatens public stability or touches upon domains beyond established scientific frameworks. The gap between knowledge and disclosure widens. The language shifts from descriptive to evasive. Reports lose detail, observations lose context, and the truth becomes something managed, not shared. And so, while NASA insisted upon the normalcy of Atlas, the data revealed a different reality, one that the agency was unwilling to confront publicly. Their silence, their omissions, their carefully curated phrasing all pointed to a single conclusion. They had recognized the impossibility of Atlas long before the public did, and instead of raising an alarm, they chose to brace for something they did not yet understand. The brightness behavior of Atlas became one of the most disturbing aspects of its observational profile, not because it fluctuated, but because it fluctuated with intention. Natural comets brighten as sunlight heats volatile materials, causing them to sublimate and produce expanding clouds of gas and dust. This process is messy, uneven, and dictated entirely by temperature and rotation. But Atlas did not brighten with heat. It brightened with purpose. Its luminosity changed not in response to solar radiation, but in response to phases that appeared aligned with its maneuvers, its transmissions, and its positional geometry within the solar system. In essence, Atlas behaved as though it were controlling its own visibility. During one observational period, telescopes recorded a sudden collapse in brightness, so complete that the object nearly vanished from detection, its albedo dropping to levels far below what any natural body could achieve merely by rotating or shadowing itself. There was no fragmentation, no dispersal, no mass loss, only a total and instantaneous shift into optical dormancy. Seconds later, the object returned, not gradually but abruptly, radiating with a brightness so pure and uniform that it resembled controlled emission rather than reflected sunlight. The transition was binary, like a switch being toggled. Attempts to model this behavior through outgassing proved futile. Sublimation cannot turn off, it cannot pause between frames, it cannot reactivate with a crisp spectral signature that remains perfectly stable for minutes at a time. Yet Atlas demonstrated all of these traits. Its brightness dipped and surged with a consistency that suggested internal regulation. Some researchers liken the effect to adaptive camouflage an organism, altering its appearance in response to environmental conditions. Others proposed that the object might possess a layered exterior capable of adjusting reflectivity through mechanical or electromagnetic means. But all explanations returned to the same conclusion. Whatever controlled the brightness was not a natural process. The spectral shifts accompanying the brightness cycles were equally troubling. When Atlas dimmed, the wavelengths reflected from its surface shifted into a pattern resembling absorption, as though a thin, uniform film had covered the exterior. But when Atlas brightened, the spectral distribution became unnaturally clean, narrow, stable, and free of the chaotic scattering that defines dust clouds. It was as if the object possessed a surface capable of reorganizing itself, tightening its structure to produce consistent reflections, loosening it to minimize detection. No comet in astronomical history has ever demonstrated anything remotely similar. More alarming still was the timing of the luminosity events. The brightest flares occurred immediately after Atlas executed its controlled course corrections, and again after periods when radio emissions intensified. The faintest dips aligned with moments when the object passed regions where inbound sunlight would create observational advantages for Earth's telescopes. In other words, Atlas dimmed precisely when it should have been brightest, and brightened precisely when its geometry offered the clearest outbound communication path to the direction from which it originated. These correlations were too exact to dismiss. They suggested that Atlas was modulating its optical signature as part of a coordinated operational cycle. This behavior transformed the perception of Atlas from a passive anomaly into something far more active, an object aware of its environment, aware of observational geometry, aware of the limitations of its detectability. And that awareness implied something far more unsettling. Atlas understood when it was being watched. Whether this awareness was autonomous, programmed, or the product of an intelligence within the object, no one could determine. But its behavior, its breathing of light, was unmistakably deliberate. And as these findings circulated among the analysts, the question that began to surface was no longer, how does Atlas do this? But why? Why would a seemingly interstellar object want to suppress or reveal its visibility with such precision? Why would it need to control how it was perceived? Why would it choose to dim at the moments when humanity had the best vantage point? The answers, if they existed, lay not in the brightness itself, but in what Atlas did immediately afterward. The deeper scientists examined the cloud of fragments surrounding Atlas, the more quickly the familiar language of cometary behavior collapsed. Natural comet fragments drift apart chaotically, each piece following its own micro-orbit dictated by rotational momentum, solar pressure, and the randomness of structural collapse. But the fragments near Atlas defied all of these expectations. Instead of dispersing, they held formation. Instead of tumbling unpredictably, they moved with subtle precision, adjusting their spacing, maintaining consistent distances, and reacting to Atlas's maneuvers with timing that could only be described as synchronized. This was not debris. This was accompaniment. Observatories first noted the anomaly when a cluster of small bodies, initially believed to be outgassed material, maintained the same angular separation from Atlas for days on end. Under normal conditions, those fragments should have drifted apart within hours, scattered by solar wind and differential momentum. Yet telescope arrays confirmed that the objects altered their trajectories in lockstep with the parent body. When Atlas dimmed, the fragments dimmed. When Atlas brightened, they brightened. When Atlas adjusted course, they followed, not approximately, but precisely, as though connected by invisible geometry. Attempts to categorize the fragments as gravitationally bound mini-moons failed immediately. Their mass was too small, their distances too large, and the parent object's gravitational field too weak to keep them in place. Yet they behaved as though attached by some organizational force, not gravitational but operational. Observers proposed electromagnetic tethering, but the required field strength would have been detectable, and no such field appeared. Others considered that the fragments might be hollow, lightweight, engineered to respond to external cues. But the idea of engineered sub-objects raised an even more disturbing question. If they were engineered, then they were not fragments at all. They were components. Their reflective properties contributed to the unease. Unlike natural debris clouds, which produce irregular scattering of light due to irregular surfaces, this formation reflected brightness shifts uniformly. When Atlas brightened, the fragments brightened in the same spectral bands and at the same rate, as though their surfaces consisted of the same adaptive material. Observers noted distinct moments when the fragments collectively adjusted their orientation, producing synchronized glints detectable across multiple observatories. Natural debris cannot coordinate. These objects did. But the most unsettling discovery came when analysts plotted the relative spacing of the fragments. Over time, their positions mapped into patterns, subtle geometric configurations repeating at consistent intervals. The formation shifted through sequences resembling calibration matrices or sensor array alignments. These were not the patterns of broken rock. They were the patterns of a distributed system reconfiguring itself in response to operational needs. And then came the detail that silenced even the most skeptical voices. During a brief observation window, as Atlas executed a minute course correction, one of the fragments increased its velocity relative to the others, closed distance to the main body, hovered in alignment for several minutes, and then drifted back into formation. This behavior could not be explained by sublimation, rotation, solar pressure, or any natural mechanism. It was purposeful repositioning, the kind associated with maintenance units or data relays adjusting their relative geometry to the core structure. When the Scientific Council reviewed the telemetry, one conclusion became unavoidable. The objects surrounding Atlas were not remnants of a disintegrating body. They were satellites' auxiliary units functioning as part of a coordinated system. Whether they were sensors, buffers, stabilizers, or communication nodes remained unknown, but their behavior was too precise, too adaptive, too synchronized to be anything other than intentional. And if Atlas traveled with a formation, it meant that Atlas did not arrive alone. The idea that the object was a solitary wanderer collapsed instantly. Instead, the image forming in the minds of analysts was far more complex and far more unsettling. Atlas was not a singular craft. It was a composite construct, accompanied by smaller units designed to enhance, protect, or augment its mission. This structure hinted at a level of sophistication far beyond simple reconnaissance. It suggested purpose, preparation, coordination, and most disturbingly, it suggested hierarchy. Because wherever such formations exist, there is always something directing them. As the fragment's behavior cemented the idea that Atlas was operating as a coordinated system rather than a solitary body, a new question emerged, one that reshaped every prior assumption about its presence in the solar system. What exactly was it doing here? Because the deeper scientists examined its movements, the clearer the pattern became. Atlas was not drifting. It was surveying. Its trajectory did not resemble the random, elongated arc of an interstellar ice fragment, simply falling through the gravity well of the Sun. Instead, it resembled the deliberate path of an object gathering information from multiple vantage points, performing structured passes optimized for observation, analysis, and assessment. The first clue came from the sequence of planetary alignments. Rather than taking a chaotic or inefficient route through the inner system, Atlas positioned itself repeatedly along geometries that maximized visibility of planetary bodies, especially Mars, Venus, and Earth. These alignments occurred with a regularity too precise to be accidental. When Mars occupied a position that offered an unobstructed observation corridor, Atlas adjusted its approach vector. When Earth's position allowed for long-range atmospheric scanning windows, Atlas slowed its rotation and dimmed its optical signature, as though transitioning into a passive observational mode. Natural bodies do not adjust their behavior according to observational geometry. Intelligence does. Even more disturbing was how Atlas behaved near Mars. Instead of simply passing by, it executed a subtle deceleration and maintained orientation toward the planet for a duration far exceeding what gravitational dynamics required. During this interval, instruments detected a faint pattern of high-frequency pulses, not radio transmissions, but something closer to active scanning. The emissions resembled a form of probing signal, bouncing off atmospheric remnants and surface compositions, analyzing mineral distributions, perhaps even searching for remnants of biological activity. These were not emissions of communication, they were emissions of inspection. Venus showed a similar anomaly. As Atlas crossed a corridor offering a rare vantage point into Venus's dense atmosphere, the object increased its brightness in specific spectral bands that penetrate Venus's cloud layers more efficiently. At the same moment, several observatories recorded subtle fluctuations in the returning signal, indicating that Atlas was not merely reflecting sunlight, but modulating its illumination intentionally. The object appeared to be adjusting its emission spectrum to gather data from one of the most hostile environments in the solar system. But the most alarming part of its reconnaissance behavior came during the Earth-crossing segment of its trajectory. Instead of barreling through with the chaotic brilliance of a disintegrating comet, Atlas slowed down, not dramatically, but perceptibly aligning itself along an arc that provided uninterrupted line-of-sight access to Earth's magnetosphere, ionosphere, and atmospheric profile. During this period, the object dimmed almost completely, as though entering a low-visibility mode, while simultaneously emitting a sequence of pulses that mapped perfectly onto known atmospheric penetration frequencies. It did not broadcast outward, it did not communicate with Earth, it measured Earth. The correlation between the scanning maneuvers and the outbound transmissions later detected was unequivocal. Each time Atlas passed a scanning threshold, crossing a planetary magnetic boundary, entering optimal geometry for atmospheric probing, or completing a mineral-oriented observation. Another radio burst followed, transmitted outward along the same interstellar vector. These pulses resembled a log, a structured series of results dispatched to a recipient not within the solar system but far beyond it. And as analysts reconstructed the entire observational sequence, the truth became unmistakable. Atlas was performing reconnaissance long-range, high-resolution, multi-target reconnaissance that incorporated planetary chemistry, magnetic fields, atmospheric dynamics, surface structures, and perhaps even technological signatures. This was not casual curiosity. This was systematic evaluation. The implications of this conclusion pressed heavily on the Scientific Council. An object like Atlas does not enter a system of planets merely to catalogue geological trivia. It does not carry coordinated components and sculpted materials to inspect the barren surfaces of dead worlds. It does not transmit structured results across interstellar distances unless those results matter, and the structured sequence of its reconnaissance suggested something that no one wanted to articulate but everyone understood. Atlas had not come to visit the solar system. Atlas had come to assess it, and if it had come to assess it, then its departure was not the end of a journey. It was the completion of a mission. The closer researchers looked at the trajectory of Atlas, the more its path resembled something entirely incompatible with natural motion. In celestial mechanics, every object behaves according to predictable principles, accelerating as it falls toward gravity wells, decelerating as it climbs away, rotating according to the random violence of its formation, wobbling chaotically as sunlight sublimates its surface. But Atlas violated these principles with a quiet, unnerving confidence, performing maneuvers that belonged not to drifting fragments of ancient ice, but to guided instruments executing calculated tasks. Its course corrected itself with angles so smooth, clean, and mathematically deliberate that the models built to describe them had to be rewritten, not because the physics had changed, but because the object was not obeying the physics at all. One of the earliest indicators of unnatural behaviour came from its rotational profile. Natural bodies tumble irregularly, their axes shifting with every fragment shed and every jet of sublimating gas. But Atlas rotated with a stability that bordered on engineered precision. When it accelerated, its spin remained constant. When it dimmed, its orientation adjusted by just a few degrees, always toward positions optimal for either scanning or transmission. There was no chaotic drift, no random tumbling, no wobble from momenta shifts. Instead, its motion resembled the behaviour of a system equipped with internal stabilizers. Then came the orientation shifts, subtle tilts and pivots that occurred without any corresponding outgassing events or gravitational triggers. In one observation window, Atlas appeared to face a particular region of space, holding orientation for several hours before gradually rotating back into its nominal configuration. Natural bodies do not do this. They have no reason to. Yet Atlas demonstrated orientation control repeatedly, especially during periods when its associated fragments altered their spacing or when its outbound transmissions increased in intensity. These coordinated moves could only be interpreted as adjustments aligned with internal objectives. The most striking anomaly, however, was the consistency of its angular corrections. When subject to gravitational perturbations, such as during its passage through the inner system, Atlas responded not by drifting off course, but by compensating in a manner that preserved its intended trajectory. The corrective impulses did not resemble the chaotic bursts typical of volatile jets. Instead, they looked like the steady periodic firings of a propulsion system, weak enough to avoid easy detection, but precise enough to maintain the narrow corridors necessary for its reconnaissance. Astrophysicists attempted to model these shifts using known natural forces, but every attempt failed spectacularly. Radiation pressure could not account for the timing, outgassing could not account for the symmetry, gravitational interactions could not explain the repeated stabilization to exact orientations. Even chaotic modelling used to describe highly irregular bodies fell apart, because Atlas's movement was not irregular, it was consistent, predictable, intentional. Further analysis revealed something even more unsettling. Every major geometric maneuver coincided with moments of heightened scanning efficiency. When Atlas aligned with the plane of Mars's magnetic field, it executed a microcorrection that allowed it to pass through with maximal sensitivity. When Earth's atmospheric refractive index reached seasonal minimums, Atlas adjusted its relative inclination, creating a window through which it could more effectively measure upper atmospheric density. These were not coincidences, they were optimizations. And then scientists noticed a pattern no one had expected. When Atlas positioned itself for outbound transmission aligning perfectly with the interstellar vector from which it had entered the solar system, the fragments surrounding it shifted their positions into a hexagonal pattern, as though forming a distributed antenna or focusing array. The angles between fragments matched ratios found in energy distribution systems, and as the formation settled into place, the outbound signal strengthened. In short, Atlas was not merely orienting itself, it was deploying itself. All of this led to one unavoidable conclusion. Atlas did not move through space the way natural bodies do. It moved the way constructed systems do, systems built for endurance, precision, and purpose. It corrected its path when necessary. It oriented itself toward targets. It stabilized its rotation during data collection. It formed geometric configurations with subordinate units. It behaved like a reconnaissance craft, which meant that every turn, every adjustment, every geometric impossibility was not an accident of physics, but a message in motion, a message stating, with silent mechanical clarity, that Atlas was under control. And the only question left was, controlled by what? When analysts finally stepped back and examined the broader historical context surrounding Atlas, a chilling hypothesis began to spread through the scientific council, slowly at first, then with accelerating conviction. The more they studied the object's structure, its coordinated fragments, its controlled maneuvers, its encoded transmissions, and its deliberate reconnaissance of multiple planets, the more one disturbing possibility surfaced. What if this was not the first time? What if humanity had not merely observed Atlas by chance, but had been observed long before humanity ever knew how to look upward? What if our civilization, in all its perceived independence and emergence, had been noticed, monitored, or even catalogued by whatever intelligence sent this object into our solar system? It was an idea so vast that at first it seemed absurd. And yet, history is filled with strange absences, gaps in explanation, myths of sky visitors, sudden peaks in early cultural development, inexplicable alignments of ancient structures with astronomical precision. These fragments of the human timeline, long dismissed as coincidence or imagination, suddenly took on a different weight when viewed through the lens of Atlas's presence. Because if an object this advanced had entered our solar system before, perhaps during an era when we had no telescopes, no sensors, no language to even interpret its arrival, then our world would not have noticed. But the intelligence behind Atlas would have. The theory gained more ground as analysts reconstructed Atlas's long-term inbound trajectory. Extrapolation suggested that thousands of years ago, the object or something with identical orbital characteristics may have passed through the inner solar system at a time that aligns eerily with the dawn of human civilization. Around 8,000 years ago, humanity transitioned almost simultaneously across multiple regions from nomadic life to agriculture, architecture, astronomy, mathematics. Was this coincidence? Almost certainly. But then again, the trajectory that would place Atlas in the vicinity of Earth during that period was not a coincidence. It was physics. And the physics suggested a return cycle. If Atlas had passed here before, even once, it would have done so with the same quiet efficiency, the same controlled trajectory, the same scanning behavior. Our ancestors would have seen nothing but a faint streak of light, or nothing at all. But the intelligence guiding Atlas would have gathered data. It would have measured atmospheric composition, magnetic field strength, biosphere complexity. And perhaps, just perhaps, it would have noticed something else, something that made this planet stand out from the countless worlds drifting silently through space. The emergence of a species capable of reflection, capable of constructing tools, capable of building cities, capable of transmitting radio waves, launching satellites, reshaping an entire planet's surface within a fraction of geological time, a species that, by cosmic standards, evolved explosively fast. This realization forced the Council to confront an uncomfortable truth. Civilization may feel self-created, self-directed, but evolution does not occur in isolation. And if an intelligence had observed Earth before, it might have marked humanity as a developing entity worth watching, worth evaluating, worth returning to. But the more frightening perspective was this. What if the probes were not here to observe our rise, but to measure whether our rise had continued according to expectations? Civilizations do not emerge in predictable patterns. They surge, collapse, rise again. They gather knowledge, lose it, rediscover it. From the vantage point of an intelligence that monitors systems across millennia, Earth would be a world that has changed dramatically in a shockingly short span of time. That kind of acceleration is not merely unusual, it is unstable, unpredictable, potentially dangerous. And so the question shifted from were we noticed to were we being tracked? Atlas's behaviour, its scanning, its coordinated formation, its intelligent geometry suggested a mission designed to evaluate the current state of the solar system, not merely its physics, but its inhabitants. And if humanity was indeed part of that evaluation, then the intelligence behind Atlas may have been monitoring us since before we learned to write our own history, which led to the most unsettling question of all. If this intelligence has been aware of humanity for thousands of years, why return now? The answer, whatever it may be, is unlikely to be comforting. As the investigation deepened, every detail of Atlas's behaviour pointed toward a purpose far more complex than reconnaissance alone. It did not simply observe planets, scan atmospheres, or map mineral compositions. It did something far more deliberate, far more consequential, and far more alarming. It sent information outward, not randomly, not incidentally, but with precision, structure, and consistency. The transmissions were narrow-beamed, encoded and directed not toward any object within our solar system, but toward the same region of interstellar space from which Atlas had arrived. It was reporting back. The moment analysts confirmed that the radio emissions were not naturally generated reflections but intentional outbound signals, the tone within the scientific council shifted from curiosity to dread. Natural objects do not encode information. They do not time their pulses to correspond with observational milestones. They do not compress data into structured bursts. Yet Atlas did all of these things, behaving as though it was summarizing its mission-compiling environmental metrics, biosphere signatures, energy readings, atmospheric profiles, and likely even technological observations about Earth. Each burst occurred after a specific threshold event: a close pass by a planet, a successful atmospheric scan, a geometric reorientation, or a moment of gravitational equilibrium. These bursts were not random, they were checkpoints. The pattern resembled the behaviour of long-duration autonomous probes that periodically send status updates to their origin points. Except this probe was not ours. It was older, more advanced, built with an elegance that did not merely surpass human engineering, it made human engineering look primitive. The encoded nature of the transmissions added another layer of horror. By analysing frequency drift, modulation density and pulse symmetry, researchers determined that the bursts contained variable blocks of compressed data units that resembled data packets, each with internal structure and repeated sub-patterns. These were not simple signals, they were messages. When scientists matched the timing of the bursts with the object's movement, a clear picture emerged. Atlas had been building a report of our solar system. It spent decades scanning Mars, mapping its chemical scars, documenting its fossilized past. It passed Venus, sampling atmospheric decay and greenhouse composition. It lingered near Earth just long enough to analyze atmospheric chemistry, magnetic field structure, electromagnetic noise, and the signatures of human technology satellite constellations, radio towers, radar sweeps, orbital debris patterns. And each time it gathered something significant, it packaged the results into data and transmitted them outward. This was not reconnaissance. This was evaluation. The most alarming finding came when analysts compared the outbound signal strength during different phases of Atlas's journey. The transmissions following Mars and Venus were strong but intermittent. The transmissions following Earth were substantially stronger. It was as if the data gathered near Earth contained something critical, something that required greater encoding density or tighter transmission focus. Whatever Atlas detected near Earth mattered, and it mattered enough that it triggered a final, long-duration data burst as the object prepared to exit the inner solar system, its strongest transmission yet. One detail in particular sent a chill through every institution involved. The outbound transmissions accelerated in frequency as Atlas left Earth's vicinity. That behavior resembled a system completing a final synchronization, like a device finishing its report before entering the next phase of its mission. And once the final burst was sent, Atlas shifted into a trajectory that removed it from any further meaningful interaction with our system. Its purpose was complete. The implications were devastating. The intelligence behind Atlas now possessed a detailed portrait of our solar system, our geology, our chemistry, our biosphere, and most critically, our level of technological development. Our planet had been scanned, measured, encoded, and delivered across the void. And the most terrifying truth was this: we have no idea how long it will take for that information to reach its destination, nor what decision will be made once it does. Atlas did not malfunction. It did not drift here by accident. It came, it surveyed, it transmitted, and it left. The report is already on its way. As scientists piece together the patterns, every maneuver, every brightness modulation, every coordinated shift of its fragmentary formation, every outbound transmission, a darker and far more consequential question began pressing itself into the center of the discussion. What exactly was Atlas evaluating? Because its behavior was too selective, too structured, too data-driven to suggest a simple cataloging of the solar system. It wasn't mapping planets the way human probes do. It wasn't studying geology for academic curiosity. It wasn't sampling atmospheres to understand chemistry. Every action, every pass, every signal, every maneuver pointed toward a purpose that extended beyond observation and into judgment. Atlas wasn't gathering information. It was measuring something, comparing something, testing something. And the clearest evidence of this intent came from the density and timing of its transmissions after leaving Earth. Across all observational periods, no planet triggered a more complex emission sequence than ours. The pulses following Mars were structured but sparse. Those after Venus were orderly but brief. But the signals following Earth were denser than any preceding cluster compressed, with an urgency that researchers could only interpret as significance. Whatever Atlas found here mattered more than anything found elsewhere. And this led analysts to an unsettling inference. Atlas wasn't simply scanning our biosphere or our atmosphere. It was evaluating our status. One line of reasoning suggested that Atlas was assessing Earth's environmental stability. The object performed high-resolution atmospheric scans, mapping density gradients, chemical imbalances, and the accelerating imprint of industrialization. It examined the magnetosphere, perhaps probing the resilience of our planet's protective envelope. It recorded greenhouse signatures, ozone variations, and electromagnetic noise levels. To an intelligence monitoring planetary development, these factors would determine whether a world was stable, degrading, or undergoing transformation. But even this explanation felt incomplete. Atlas did not linger long enough to study long-term climate cycles. It did not repeat passes to observe change. It gathered a snapshot and immediate evaluation, not a historical analysis. A second theory pushed deeper into existential territory. Perhaps Atlas was evaluating technological emergence. Earth's electromagnetic environment has changed dramatically in a century. Radio towers, satellites, radar systems, digital transmissions. Our planet now leaks information into space continuously. To any intelligence scanning the cosmos for signals of rising civilizations, this would be a beacon. And Atlas's behavior matched that of a system designed to verify such emergence. It scanned multiple wavelengths associated with communication. It mapped satellite constellations. It analyzed orbital traffic. It examined ionospheric disturbances shaped by broadcasting infrastructure. If technological development was the metric, then Atlas was assessing how far humanity had advanced, and how quickly. But the most disturbing hypothesis gained momentum as analysts reviewed the orientation patterns, the scanning geometry, and the final outbound transmissions. It proposed that Atlas was not evaluating Earth as a thriving planet, but as a potential threat. Civilizations that rise rapidly, alter their environment aggressively, and radiate technological signatures into space may not appear as passive objects to an older intelligence. They may appear as unpredictable variables worlds capable of expansion, interference, or disruption. If an extraterrestrial system runs periodic assessments of star systems to identify instability or potential danger, then Earth loud, active, accelerating, would stand out sharply against the quiet geological histories of Mars, Venus, and the other worlds. This framework produced a chilling interpretation. Atlas was assessing risk, not ecological risk, not geological risk, civilizational risk. And when analysts revisited the outbound bursts, the realization became nearly impossible to dismiss. The data density was not the signature of resource evaluation. It was the signature of classification, a threshold report, summarizing Earth's state in a format optimized for receiving intelligence. Another disturbing clue lay in the symmetry of its scanning pattern. Atlas evaluated Mars, thoroughly measuring what a biosphere looked like when extinct. It evaluated Venus, what a biosphere looks like when it collapses. It evaluated Earth, what a biosphere looks like when it is awake, accelerating, expanding. This triad formed a comparative matrix: failure, catastrophe, emergence. Every planet served as a data point, but Earth was the one whose outcome was unresolved. Earth was the variable, and when systems evaluate variables, they do so for a reason. Perhaps Atlas was simply performing a scheduled assessment routine monitoring conducted across thousands of star systems. Perhaps its transmissions were reports with no immediate consequence. But the shape of its behavior, the precision of its actions, and the urgency of its final signal suggested something else. Earth has been entered into a decision-making process, a process humanity cannot influence, a process governed by criteria we do not understand, a process whose next steps will unfold far beyond our reach. As the Council absorbed this conclusion, a new silence settled in the room, a silence deeper than fear, deeper than uncertainty, a silence built on the recognition that the solar system had already been judged and that whatever awaits us is no longer in motion here but elsewhere, speeding through interstellar space toward the intelligence that sent Atlas on its mission. As Atlas completed its final pass through the inner solar system, every remaining doubt about its purpose evaporated. The object's behavior shifted in a way that no natural body, no comet, no asteroid, no fragment of interstellar debris had ever demonstrated. Instead of undergoing chaotic disintegration as it approached the Sun, instead of fragmenting into dust as thermal stress peaked, Atlas became quieter, more controlled, more deliberate. Its brightness stabilized into a narrow spectral band, its fragmentary units tightened their formation, and its outbound signal, previously intermittent and segmented, condensed into a prolonged, uninterrupted transmission. It was as though the object had reached the end of a checklist, completed every scan, evaluated every target, and was now preparing to deliver a final, conclusive report. During its closest approach to the Sun, a moment when natural comets erupt with gas and collapse under the violence of sublimation, Atlas did the opposite. It did not flare chaotically, it did not lose mass, it did not exhibit rotational instability. Instead, it dimmed sharply, completely dropping into a state of near invisibility. Telescopes reported an albedo so low that, for a brief period, the object vanished entirely from optical tracking. Only infrared sensors and radio telescopes maintained lock, confirming that Atlas had not disintegrated. It had simply withdrawn its reflective signature, concealing itself at the moment when physics demanded the opposite, and that was the moment the final transmission began. The burst that followed was unlike any previous signal Atlas had emitted. Earlier pulses were short, rhythmic, segmented into data packets that corresponded with specific scanning thresholds. But this transmission was continuous, longer, denser, and vastly more powerful. It unfolded across multiple frequencies simultaneously, forming a layered emission whose structure resembled the type of compressed, multi-channel communication a probe might send at the culmination of a mission. The encoding complexity increased dramatically, suggesting that the message contained everything Atlas had gathered: the chemical blueprint of Mars, the atmospheric degradation profile of Venus, the electromagnetic and technological signature of Earth. In effect, this final burst was not a message, it was a delivery. What made the event even more disturbing was its direction. Earlier transmissions had been focused along the same outbound vector from which Atlas had arrived, a faint but consistent interstellar corridor pointing into deep space. But the final burst sharpened that focus, narrowing into a beam so precise that researchers described it as surgically directed. It was the kind of transmission you would send not into the void, but to a specific recipient, across a distance where every photon mattered. And once the transmission ended, abruptly, with no tapering, Atlas initiated a maneuver that no natural object could perform, a controlled exit. As the object retreated from the Sun's influence, its trajectory did not resemble the chaotic debris paths left by comets that survive perihelion. Instead of scattering, wobbling, or accelerating unpredictably, Atlas adopted a clean outbound arc directly aligned with the same interstellar vector as its transmission. It did not drift away. It departed. Its speed increased smoothly, as though powered by an internal mechanism compensating for solar deceleration. And as the fragments surrounding it adjusted their positions, falling into a configuration that resembled a protective envelope around the core, the object disappeared behind a veil of decreasing luminosity. Even then, Atlas performed one final anomaly. As it crossed the outer detection threshold of our telescopes, its reflective signature pulsed once, just once, in a perfect interval matching the earliest radio bursts it emitted upon entering the solar system. It was as though the object marked the end of its mission, with the same signal that marked its beginning, closing a loop that humanity had only partially witnessed. When the Scientific Council reviewed the full chain of events, a realization settled over them like a weight. Atlas had not come here to gather data for itself. It was not exploring. It was not surveying. It was fulfilling an assigned task. It entered the solar system, executed a systematic reconnaissance of multiple worlds, directed its attention toward Earth with heightened precision, compiled everything it found into an encoded transmission, sent that transmission across interstellar space, and exited with mechanical discipline. It did not arrive accidentally. It did not behave chaotically. It did not leave unfinished. Atlas completed its mission here, above Earth, because Earth was the final variable. Whatever decision is now unfolding in the darkness between the stars will not involve us. It will not ask for our cooperation, our consent, or our understanding. The moment Atlas's final transmission left our solar system, humanity's role shifted from participant to subject. And subjecthood has only one truth. Our evaluation is already in someone else's hands. In the days that followed Atlas's departure, the scientific world experienced a paradox so profound that it left even the most seasoned researchers unmoored. On the surface, nothing had changed. The planets continued their timeless orbits. The magnetic field pulsed in its familiar rhythm. Satellites circled the Earth with engineered obedience. Sunlight fell across continents with the same indifference it had for billions of years. And yet, beneath that calm exterior, beneath the illusion of continuity, lay a truth so immense and so quietly devastating that it altered the psychological landscape of everyone who understood its implications. Because the moment Atlas vanished into the background glow of deep space, humanity's position in the universe shifted, subtly, silently, irrevocably. No one said it out loud. Not at first. Not in the conference rooms where exhausted scientists compared their final notes. Not in the private meetings of government advisors trying to quantify what had just unfolded. And certainly not in the rare closed sessions where the most classified fragments of data were reviewed one last time. But the truth hung in the air with a weight that none of them could disperse. The solar system had been surveyed, not casually, not incidentally, purposefully, mechanically, systematically. And the results of that survey were no longer here. They were no longer ours. They were travelling across the void, encoded into a signal carried toward an origin humanity has no means to reach, no means to interrupt, no means to understand. The silence that followed the final transmission became its own kind of message. Atlas had not attempted contact. It had not broadcast a greeting, a warning, an invitation, or a threat. It had remained perfectly indifferent to the existence of the species that watched it with breathless confusion. That indifference was perhaps the most terrifying revelation of all. To whatever intelligence deployed Atlas, humanity did not require acknowledgement. We were not addressed, not approached, not engaged. We were examined. That distinction, subtle in language, overwhelming in meaning, marked the boundary between curiosity and classification. And Atlas behaved not as a visitor, but as an instrument executing a protocol whose parameters were set long before our telescopes detected it. Some argued that this realization should bring comfort. After all, Atlas caused no harm, delivered no ultimatum, made no demands. But comfort was not what settled in the minds of those who truly understood the encounter. Instead, there was an awareness, a cold, expanding awareness, that Earth's autonomy was always an illusion. We have spent centuries believing that our fears, our decisions, our wars, our triumphs, our technology mattered on a cosmic scale. Atlas shattered that illusion without a sound. It showed us that the universe is not empty, it is not unaware, and it is not waiting for humanity to introduce itself. It is already watching, already listening, already measuring. And the most haunting thought, the one no scientist dared to express, yet all of them felt, was this. Atlas behaved too calmly to be a scout encountering a new species for the first time. It behaved like something familiar with the routine, something that had done this before, something that returned not out of curiosity but out of obligation, the same way a mechanism returns to a checkpoint or a system runs a scheduled diagnostic. In that interpretation, Atlas's arrival was not extraordinary. It was expected. Not by us, but by whatever intelligence governs the cycles beyond our understanding. Which means one truth stands above all others. If Atlas was part of a recurring process, then its departure does not bring closure, it brings anticipation. Somewhere, across the unimaginable distances of interstellar space, a decision-making entity is now in possession of everything it needs to evaluate the solar system. The biological volatility of Earth, the extinction profile of Mars, the atmospheric instability of Venus, the technological rise of humanity. The signal has been delivered. The process is no longer in motion here. It is unfolding elsewhere. And the next phase, whatever it may be, will not begin with our consent, nor our preparation, nor our readiness. It will begin when the intelligence that sent Atlas decides it must. Whether that happens in years, decades, centuries or longer, humanity will not control the timing. We will only bear witness. Until then, we live in the calm that follows a question asked across the stars, a question we did not hear, a question we did not choose, a question whose answer is now travelling back toward us in the silence between suns, and one day, quietly, without warning, the universe will respond.